What happens when a quiet black student solves a problem he was never supposed to understand, just to prove he deserves to sit in the room? At Westside Middle School, a 13-year-old boy stood up, not to rebel, but because his back was still bruised from a punishment no one talked about. His teacher tried to humiliate him with a college-level math problem. But what she didn't know was that Elijah Brooks had been preparing for this moment his whole life. This isn't a story about talent, it's a story about dignity, about what happens when someone who's been overlooked for too long finally gets seen for who they really are. Let me take you into that classroom and show you how one boy's quiet refusal to back down changed an entire school. The classroom air was thick, not with noise, but with a silence that weighed heavy. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't come from discipline, but from discomfort. Elijah Brooks, a slender 13-year-old sitting at the edge of room 212, remained standing. His back ached, not from some sudden injury, but from a punishment days before that left more than just bruises. "Sit down, Elijah," Ms. Delaney said, her voice sharp and short like a ruler's snap. She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she turned to the whiteboard and began scribbling numbers and symbols, lines of calculus meant for 11th graders. Then, stepping aside with a smirk, she looked directly at Elijah. "If you're so uncomfortable sitting, why don't you stretch your brain instead? Solve this." A few students chuckled nervously. Others looked down, avoiding the moment altogether. Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just stared at the problem. The markers squeaked faintly under Ms. Delaney's hand as she added one final twist to the equation. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Complex integration, multivariable derivatives, something no 8th grader was expected to touch. But Elijah didn't back down. He walked slowly toward the board. His steps were careful, deliberate, as though each movement weighed more than it should. He reached for the marker with his left hand, the same hand that had trembled the night before as he reread old textbook pages under a flickering hallway light. He didn't look at the class. He didn't look at Ms. Delaney. He just started writing. A line here, a subtraction there. Silence settled deeper as his work took shape, one step leading smoothly to the next. And then, something changed. The chuckles stopped, the whispering died down, heads lifted from desks. By the time Elijah wrote the final number, no one in the room was smiling, except Miss Delaney, but hers was a different kind of smile. "I see you've been busy plagiarizing," she said flatly. "Where'd you copy this from? TikTok?" Elijah turned to her. He didn't raise his voice. "I didn't copy it." "Sit down," she said again, her tone clipped, but he didn't move. He knew what came next. Everyone in the room did. But what they didn't know was this. The boy they dismissed was about to become the name this school would never forget. Because this time, the one they tried to shame held the key to their reckoning. Elijah didn't grow up with private tutors or stacks of prep books. He didn't attend weekend camps for gifted students or sit in front of a laptop with all the answers just a click away. What he had was a public library card, a second-hand backpack, and a curiosity that refused to go quiet. His love for numbers didn't start with a teacher. It started one evening at age 7 when his mother brought home a torn algebra workbook someone had left behind at the laundromat. Most of the pages were missing, but Elijah didn't care. He sat cross-legged on the floor, sounding out the problems, not knowing half the words, but drawn to the puzzle of it all. At night, while the world outside his window hummed with city sounds, Elijah sat under the hallway light. His family's apartment was too small for a desk, so he leaned against the wall, scribbling notes in a marble notebook. When the internet worked, he'd watch videos on his cracked phone, lessons on geometry, fractions, eventually calculus. He paused, rewound, played again, sometimes 3-4 times over. His parents, hardworking and quiet, didn't always understand what he was studying, but they saw the hunger in his eyes. His mother would leave a peanut butter sandwich next to his notebook. His father, returning from the night shift, would lower his voice in the hallway so Elijah wouldn't lose his train of thought. At school, he kept his head down. Most kids didn't talk about math at lunch. Teachers saw a polite student who finished his work, nothing more. And that was fine with Elijah. He wasn't doing this to impress anyone. He did it because every formula felt like a map, and he was trying to find his way to something that made sense. But that morning, standing at the board with Miss Delaney watching him like he'd just stepped out of line, Elijah realized something. He had never asked for the spotlight, but now that it found him, maybe it was time to stop shrinking from it. The bell rang. He turned back to his desk, but Miss Delaney's voice cut through the moment. "We're not done here." No one laughed. No one cheered. Just silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was waiting for something. Miss Delaney didn't move. She stood next to the whiteboard, arms folded, eyes fixed on Elijah's back, like she was waiting for him to trip over something invisible. Her voice, when it came, was flat and cutting. "You expect me to believe that you, without instruction, without access, just happened to solve an advanced calculus problem meant for students 4 years ahead of you?" Elijah didn't respond. He knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity, it was containment. Miss Delaney walked to the board and stared at the solution again. Then, without warning, she reached for the eraser. The math disappeared in seconds, each line vanishing under her hand, like it was never there. "You don't belong up here," she said, "and this," she motioned to the space where his work had been, "this isn't yours." Then she turned to the class. "Elijah will be joining the principal now. Maybe he can explain to Mr. Walters how he managed to memorize an online solution without understanding a word of it." A few students looked away. A few shifted in their seats. Only one voice broke the silence. "Wait, he didn't cheat." It was Jasmine Carter. She was quiet, always had been, but her voice, though soft, was firm. "I sit next to him. I've seen his notebook. He does this kind of math all the time." Miss Delaney ignored her. "Elijah, let's go." He stood still for a moment, not in defiance, not in fear. Just still. As if weighing what to leave behind and what to carry with him. Then he picked up his notebook, creased and half full, and walked out the door. Not a word. Not a glance back. The hallway was empty. Lockers lined the walls like silent witnesses. He didn't rush. He didn't slouch. He walked with the kind of dignity people confuse for arrogance, but it wasn't that. He just refused to shrink. And in room 212, where the problem had just been erased, no one spoke. Delaney adjusted her glasses. Jasmine stared down at her desk, jaw tight, and the board, now blank, held more truth than it ever had with equations on it. The door clicked shut behind him. Elijah stood inside the principal's office, the walls lined with motivational posters that hadn't motivated anyone in years. Mr. Walters sat behind a cluttered desk, adjusting his tie as Ms. Delaney stepped in close behind. She wasted no time. "We have a situation," she began, as if describing a broken projector. "Elijah presented a calculus solution in front of my 8th grade class. Clearly memorized, possibly plagiarized. I'd like to recommend disciplinary action, immediate." Elijah didn't look at her. He was staring at a framed photograph on the wall. It showed Mr. Walters shaking hands with a local city councilman, both smiling in stiff suits. "Is this true?" the principal asked, his voice tired but not yet hostile. Elijah nodded slowly. "I solved the problem, but I didn't copy anything." "Then, how did you know how to solve it?" "I study," Elijah replied. His voice was calm. "At home, at the library, online when I can." Ms. Delaney scoffed. "With all due respect, we're talking about concepts even some of our juniors struggle with. This isn't a question of effort, it's a question of access and supervision." Mr. Walters leaned back in his chair. "Elijah, do your parents know you're working on this kind of material?" Elijah hesitated. "They know I like math. They let me study at night. They just trust me." The room went quiet for a beat too long. Mr. Walters rubbed his temples. "You understand the position this puts us in, right? We have standards, curriculum levels, procedures." Elijah nodded again. But he didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't mention the real reason he couldn't sit that morning. He didn't lift his shirt. He didn't point to the bruises. He had learned that sometimes even when you speak, people don't really listen. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, not to block anyone out, but to hold himself together. "I didn't cheat," he said again. Not louder, just firmer. And somehow, it sounded like the most honest sentence in the whole room. But honesty wasn't the currency here. Not yet. The knock on the door was gentle, almost hesitant. Mr. Walters looked up from his desk. "Come in." The door opened, and in stepped Miss Carter, science teacher, soft-spoken, early 40s, with a presence that rarely drew attention in meetings but always commanded respect in the lab. She glanced at Elijah, then at Miss Delaney, and finally at the principal. I heard there was a concern about Elijah Brooks, she said calmly. Miss Delaney folded her arms, her voice quick and clipped. Yes, he presented a calculus solution during homeroom, clearly out of his depth, possibly lifted from somewhere. He's refusing to explain where he learned it. Miss Carter didn't blink. She walked over and placed a thin blue folder on the desk. Elijah is not out of his depth, she said. He built a working prototype for his science fair project last fall, a water purification system using pressure variance. It required differential equations. He solved them by hand. Mr. Walters furrowed his brow. We don't teach differential equations in middle school. Miss Carter nodded. We don't. He taught himself. She looked at Elijah now, not with pity, not with awe, just recognition. He came to me last semester with a question about volume displacement in dynamic systems. I thought he was quoting something from a video. He wasn't. He was building something, and he understood the math better than some college freshman I've mentored. Miss Delaney's voice rose slightly. Why wasn't this brought to the academic board? Because he asked me not to, Miss Carter said simply. He said he didn't want extra attention, that he didn't want trouble. She paused. He just wanted to keep learning. Elijah stayed silent, but his grip on the notebook in his lap eased a little. For the first time that morning, someone in that room wasn't questioning him. They were standing beside him, and that quiet alignment, unannounced, unscripted, spoke louder than any accusation had. Miss Carter sat down without invitation, not to make a scene, but to make it clear she wasn't going anywhere. The room had settled into a tense quiet. Mr. Walters tapped his pen against the desk, slow and rhythmic, as if waiting for something neither he nor the others could name. Then Miss Carter spoke again, her tone softer but more pointed. Elijah, she said, turning toward him, can I ask something personal? He nodded cautiously. You've been walking stiff today, moving like you're in pain. Is there something we should know? Miss Delaney shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I don't see how that's relevant to the matter. It's relevant, Miss Carter said, her eyes never leaving Elijah's face. If we're talking about fairness, then all of it matters. Elijah looked down at his hands. His fingernails were clean, clipped short. One thumbnail had a faint crack near the corner. He traced it with his thumb, as if buying time. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for the hem of his shirt. He lifted it halfway up his back. A long silence followed. There, across his lower spine and shoulder blades, were red welts, uneven, fresh, unmistakably the result of impact. Not an accident, not clumsiness. Miss Delaney froze. Mr. Walters leaned forward, face drawn tight. Who did this to you? Elijah's voice was low. I was told to hold a chair above my head for 10 minutes last Friday because I didn't turn in my homework on time. And who gave that order? Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Delaney's hands clutched the edges of her armrests, knuckles pale. He was misbehaving. I told him to reflect on his choices. I didn't mean for any harm to come to him. Miss Carter stood. You didn't mean harm, but you caused it. Mr. Walters raised a hand to steady the air. We're pausing everything right now. Elijah, you will not be disciplined. You will not return to homeroom today. And tomorrow morning, you'll take a supervised placement exam to verify your math proficiency. He looked at Miss Carter. You'll oversee it, and I'll inform the board. Elijah didn't speak, but something shifted in his face. Not relief, not victory. Just the faint loosening of a weight he had carried too long alone. Miss Delaney stood to object, but Mr. Walters cut her off. You'll remain off the classroom floor until further notice. She hesitated, then left without another word. And in the stillness she left behind, Miss Carter placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. Not to comfort him, not to guide him, just to let him know he wasn't invisible anymore. That evening, while most kids were finishing dinner or winding down in front of the TV, Elijah sat quietly at a worn-down kitchen table, his notebook open, pencil in hand. The house was dim, save for a single lamp flickering beside a stack of lined paper. A knock came at the door, not rushed, not loud. His father opened it to reveal a man in a tweed coat, glasses fogged from the cold. Dr. Aaron Roberts stepped inside with a kind nod. He wasn't Elijah's teacher. He wasn't even affiliated with the school, but for the past 4 months, he'd been something more valuable than either. A mentor who had chosen to see Elijah for who he really was. It had started when Miss Carter introduced them after seeing the complexity of Elijah's science project. Dr. Roberts, a professor at the local university, had agreed to meet the boy just once. That one meeting turned into weekly visits, quiet lessons, deep questions, no praise, no babying. Just real work, done with mutual respect. Now, facing the prospect of a supervised exam that could determine his future, and the truth of what he had endured, Elijah didn't ask for advice. He just opened his notebook and began to solve. Dr. Roberts sat across from him, flipping through a folder of advanced questions. "They may test you beyond the curriculum," he said. "Not because they expect mastery, but because they expect you to fail." "I'm not worried about the math," Elijah said. "I'm worried about what happens if I pass." Dr. Roberts paused. Then, in a voice as steady as the man himself, he replied, "That's what they're worried about too." There was no resentment in Elijah's eyes, only clarity. He continued working through the night, silent, focused, methodical. Equations flowed across the page like a language he knew better than his own name. Dr. Roberts occasionally pointed out a subtle flaw, not to correct, but to sharpen. Before leaving, the professor placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Tomorrow they'll be watching, so will I." And in that moment, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing up as himself, without apology, without permission. As Dr. Roberts stepped into the night, Elijah stood by the window, watching his mentor disappear into the dark street. Tomorrow wasn't just a test. It was the first time the system would be forced to listen. The testing room wasn't much different from any other. Fluorescent lights, a ticking wall clock, desks arranged in a grid. But today, every detail felt sharper, more deliberate. Elijah walked in with his notebook tucked under one arm and a pencil he had sharpened the night before until it felt like an extension of his hand. Miss Carter greeted him at the door. She didn't say much, just nodded, an unspoken promise that she was there, not as a shield, but as a witness. Across the room sat two observers from the district board, both with clipboards and unreadable faces. On the desk in front of him was a single envelope marked Exam A. Sealed, neutral, cold. Elijah opened it. He read the first problem, then the second. By the fifth, he stopped reading ahead. He had found his rhythm. It wasn't easy, but it was familiar. The kind of challenge he had trained for in silence, in low light, with no one watching. He worked steadily, calmly, solving not to impress, but to reveal. His lines were clean, his logic precise. He didn't scribble out answers or second-guess himself. When he finished, there were still 23 minutes left on the clock. He sat back, reviewed every line once more, then placed his pencil down. He wasn't done because time ran out. He was done because the truth didn't need more ink. The observers looked through his work with faint nods. One raised an eyebrow. Another tapped her pen twice against the page, something she only did, Miss Carter later noted, when she was surprised. Outside the room, Miss Delaney waited. Her arms were crossed, her face tense. She hadn't been allowed inside, but she had insisted on reviewing the test afterward. An hour later, when the results were in, even she couldn't refute them. Not the methods, not the logic. Not the alternative proofs Elijah had added voluntarily, solutions that weren't even expected at his level. She read the papers in silence. Then, still holding them in her hands, said quietly, "He's technically correct, on all of them." Dr. Roberts arrived just as the statement was uttered. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He walked in, nodded at Elijah, then turned to the principal and the board members. "Now that we've confirmed what he can do, the real question is, what are you going to do about what's been done to him?" Mr. Walters looked down, the weight of that question heavy in his silence. Because the math wasn't in doubt anymore. But the system that tried to erase it still was. Weeks passed, quietly, without headlines, without applause. But inside Westside Middle School, everything had changed. Miss Delaney was no longer on campus. Her name quietly disappeared from the faculty list after a full investigation. There was no formal announcement, just silence, the kind that follows accountability. But the real shift didn't come from her absence. It came from something far more lasting. The school launched a new program, the Elevate Initiative, designed to find and support students with advanced potential, no matter their age, grades, or background. No more waiting until high school. No more needing the right connections. Just curiosity, honesty, and the willingness to try. Elijah was the first mentor in the program, not because someone owed him a title, but because he had already done the work. Now, younger students came to him after school, some with notebooks full of equations, others just wanting to sit beside someone who had walked through the fire and kept his voice. He never tried to be anyone's hero, he just listened. And sometimes that was enough. Miss Carter became the program's lead. Dr. Roberts helped design its foundation. No one asked for credit. They simply showed up, again and again, because they believed in what this could become. Elijah's parents attended every board meeting, sitting in the back with quiet eyes and proud hands folded in their laps. At one meeting, when asked how they felt about all the changes, Elijah's father said only one thing: "We're proud, and we're still paying attention." Then, one morning, a new sign appeared by the school's front entrance, not high up like a decoration, but low enough for every student to see as they stepped through the door. It read, "Every student deserves to be seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are." Elijah stood in front of it, backpack slung over one shoulder, holding his old, worn notebook. His father pulled up in the same pickup truck he always drove. Elijah didn't rush to get in. He looked at the sign, just for a moment. No smile, no camera, just a quiet nod. Then he opened the door, climbed in, and they drove away, back into the ordinary world, made just a little better by what he left behind. Because this wasn't a story about revenge. It was about recognition, not the kind that needs a microphone, the kind that lasts. Because when the world finally listens to the child it once tried to silence, everyone wins. If this story moved you or reminded you of something you've seen or lived through, press 1 if you've ever felt powerless in front of someone who misused their authority. Press 2 if you believe that kindness and quiet strength still have the power to reshape everything. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, stories that speak truth, restore dignity, and refuse to look away, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the voices we need most are the ones we almost missed.